What would happen if No Rest for the Wicked wasn't exactly a Souls-like, and it wasn't exactly an aRPG like Diablo or Path of Exile? What if, just for a moment, we just imagined No Rest for the Wicked was somewhat of a hybrid between those two genres? Well, a few days ago, there was a pretty long discussion among some of the community members as to what they wanted to see happen in terms of talent trees and the new stats that might be coming to No Rest for the Wicked. But really, it seemed like there's two just camps of people. You have your Souls-like fans over on this side, and then over here you have your aRPG fans, and they kind of have this vision that's kind of isolated into their preferred bucket. And I don't really think sides are super willing to compromise and have mechanics from both and kind of just meet in the middle. So from those discussions, we were talking a lot about like talent trees and how those could actually be implemented in something like No Rest for the Wicked. And it just ultimately seemed like there was a little bit of confusion with how the current itemization is working and why we don't just expand on that rather than add talent trees. But I think the way that No Rest for the Wicked is currently designed, the itemization is very restrictive, and I think the skill or talent tree introduction will introduce a lot more unique play styles, especially catered towards some of the existing features of the game, such as like the status ailments. So to help illustrate a little bit of how I personally envision a little like this combination of talent tree and skills working, or attributes working, I went ahead and I put together a talent tree that is primarily revolving around the 4 different status ailments. You have plague, you have fire or heat, you have frost or cold, and then you have lightning damages. Now, just as a quick disclaimer, this is done on a free application that has some limitations. I have a lot more ideas outside of just the status ailments, but due to restrictions on how many things I could show on a single screen or workplace, I'm only going to show the 4 elementals, and I'll probably try to walk through some of the additional talents that I had envisioned being introduced in the game to help vary up the different builds that we could see later in the future for No Rest for the Wicked. Okay, so these are the 4 builds. First thing to note, the current design or enchantments for weapons dealing X elemental damage type, I think those need to be removed. So no longer will you just randomly have a weapon drop that deals fire damage, for example. Instead, what would happen is when you are leveling up, you get points to invest in this talent tree, and you can only invest points in a single talent tree from these. Let me zoom in here, too far. So you can only invest in a single talent from these different trees. So this first tree is going to be Plaguebringer. This is going to give your weapons plague damage. So this is where your elemental damage is going to come. So if you invest in Plaguebringer, you can only invest in plague related I guess talents and stuff like that. You can't mix and match. So another example would be we have Firestarter, and this is going to give your weapon additional heat damage. And then continuing on, we have Thundercaller. This is going to give your weapon additional lightning damage. And then finally, we have Frostbringer, which is going to give your weapon additional cold damage. So now to expand a little bit further on kind of how I, again, envision some of this working. As you invest points into this talent tree, it will have a branching path. So in this level, for example, you can only choose either Plague Doctor or Festering Sores. Plague Doctor, again, these are kind of things I came up just a little randomly, but I did spend about an hour or 2 coming up with them, so they have some thought behind them. So Plague Doctor is going to be whenever you land a charge attack or rune attack on an enemy afflicted with the plague, it's going to cause you to heal for a percentage of the damage that's dealt, but only the first hit of the charge attack or the rune attack apply that heal. That's to prevent the current playstyle that we see where people are healing for massive amounts on multi-hitting rune attacks. But also by introducing charge attacks, it's introducing a little bit more of an interesting dynamic with your weapon interactions and not just rune attacks. So the other talent that you could choose then is going to be Festering Sores, and this reads that your basic attacks and your charge attacks have a chance to apply a Festering Sore on enemies who are afflicted with the plague, and using a rune attack then pops all the accumulated sores on the enemy for a burst of plague damage. So the thought process behind this is simply that you're going to be building up damage states with your basic and charge attacks, and then you will have the option on when you want to pop them with your rune attacks. Next, we have both of the previous talents colliding into the single talent option, which is going to be Weakened Immunity, and this is going to be a way to essentially extend your plague duration by landing charge attacks and rune attacks, again introducing a little bit more interesting way to play around the plague by extending its duration with charge attacks and also your rune attacks. So in the next row, we have, again, another branching option. You can only choose one option here. So the first is going to be Choking Miasma, and that's whenever an enemy afflicted with the plague takes ticking plague damage, their stagger bar is going to increase. So this is going to, in theory, give you more stagger opportunities, so you can kind of have a chance to build up like Festering Sores. It'll give you chances to land more charge attacks, to trigger Plague Doctor, and heal up during stagger moments, stuff like that. And then the other option is going to be Brain Rot, and this is when an enemy is afflicted with the plague, that ticking damage is greatly increased. And then the capstone for this talent tree, just as an example, again, would be Rapid Contagion. And this is when an enemy is afflicted with the plague, the speed at which the plague deals its damage increases, and the duration of the effect remains the same. Or this is really trying to build off of the previous talent rows, so Choking Miasma and Brain Rot, where though you're either building your stagger bar quicker, or you're building up more damage by having the plague tick harder and faster. So that's it for the plague tree. The next one we have is going to be around the fire element. So this one we have, again, all of these trees are going to be designed the same. This is just as an example and proof of concept. Really want to try to emphasize that. But the two options that branch off first are going to be Ignition and Supernova. Ignition is simply dealing damage to an enemy who is burning, has a chance to cause that enemy to flare up and take an additional burst of heat damage. This is to encourage more of an aggressive playstyle when an enemy is on fire. And then as for Supernova, as you're dealing damage, you have a chance to grant a stacking buff, and once that buff reaches a certain stack count or threshold, it releases a burst of heat damage around you, instantly burning enemies if they aren't already burnt. And these would combine into Like a Hot Knife Through Butter. This is going to make it so that when you're attacking a burning enemy with a charge attack or rune attack, it ignores a portion of their defenses. And then building up from there, we have either Blast Furnace or Fired Up. Blast Furnace is, as an enemy is burning, the strength of the burn effect increases as the enemy is on fire. And when the effect ends, the enemy explodes with a burst of damage based on how much heat damage they took while burning. So essentially, this is just trying to, again, play into this ignition playstyle where when you trigger ignition or burn on an enemy, you want to try to get as many ignition procs as possible to build up blast furnaces as high as possible. And then for Fired Up, dealing heat damage grants the player the Fired Up stacking buff up to a certain threshold. And once you reach maximum stacks for that Fired Up buff, players' stamina consumption is greatly reduced and their overall speed is greatly increased. And so this is going to really give you a burst of aggressive opportunities. This can scale with both Ignition, Supernova. It'll help with Like a Hot Knife Through Butter. One thing to note is that these stacks would fall off very quickly if you're not applying heat damage consistently. And then finally, for the capstone, we have Ever-Burning Flames. These build off of the Blast Furnace and Fired Up passives, depending on which one you take. So Everburning Flames with Blast Furnace now causes Blast Furnace to immediately trigger a supernova around the enemy, and this would cause them to burn immediately after their burn effect ends, essentially. And then we have Fired Up, which is going to now cause you to also pulse fire damage while you have the Fired Up buff active. So again, this can now help Fired Up scale really well with, or even better with Ignition and Supernova, just because you're constantly dealing fire damage and you have all these chances to build stacks and trigger extra ignition opportunities and stuff like that. Next we have Thundercaller, this talent tree again. This electric damage or lightning damage really builds off of stagger, so that's what this talent tree is centered around. Arc Lightning is going to be dealing damage, dealing damage has a chance to cause lightning to arc from your weapon, bouncing a certain amount of times between enemies and just dealing lightning damage. So that lightning damage is going to, trigger staggers more often, stuff like that. In addition, if no enemies are nearby, the lightning can then bounce off the player. So that's to, keep this from being a dead talent in single target scenarios. Crash Lightning is going to cause a lightning strike to be called down on an enemy whenever you hit them with a charged attack or rune attack. Basically, it's going to mark them as a conduit, and after a short period of time, they're going to take a burst of lightning damage. And then I just realized that this wasn't fully showing the last part, but only important to note, similar to some of the plague stuff, only the first hit of a rune attack is going to apply the mark. This is to prevent you from using like a multi-hitting rune attack and just applying a ton of conduits on an enemy and just having them take a 5 bursts of lightning damage immediately. It would just be a little bit too much burst damage, I think. Now, both of these talents will run into Thunderstruck, and this is the talent that is going to increase your lightning damage dealt to staggered enemies by a pretty large portion. The thought here is simply that when you stagger an enemy that lightning is already good at, you're really going to be able to amplify your damage during those windows of opportunity that are presented from a lightning based build. And then continuing on, we have a utility ability called Pacemaker, and this is going to be anytime you deal lightning damage, it has a chance to grant you a stack of Pacemaker, and once you reach so many stacks, it's going to heal the player. And then finally we have Calm Before the Storm, and this is whenever an enemy is staggered, the player instantly refills their focus bar. I think it might be a little bit better to make this a portion of their focus bar instead of just completely refilling it, because that might be a little strong. But again, this is just proof of concept. And then for the capstone, we have Static Burst, and this is whenever you stagger an enemy, you deal a burst of lightning damage around the player, and then you gain an increase in attack speed. So again, this is increased attack speed is gonna really try to help you deal as much damage as possible during staggered windows. And now we have the final element, which is Frost. The first two that you'll have the choice between are going to be Frostbite and Winter Storm. Frostbite is whenever an enemy is no longer frozen, so after they've been frozen and they thaw out, they are going to be inflicted with a cold damage over time effect, and that builds up cold damage over time. So if you take Frostbite, it should in theory help you get back in, or have enemies brought back into a frozen state much quicker. And then in a similar play style as Frostbite, Winter Storm is going to cause, whenever you use a rune attack, a small blizzard to form around the player that's going to deal cold damage for a short period of time. So really this is just a more, I guess, active way to trigger these cold effects around the player. And then the main talent in this tree is Brittle Bones, and this is going to be whenever you're hitting a frozen enemy with a charge attack or a rune attack, it's going to cause the enemy to shatter and deal bonus cold damage. And then we have Frozen Tomb and Frost Armor. Frozen Tomb is whenever you're dealing cold damage to enemies, there's a chance to encase them in a block of ice, briefly allowing for the Brittle Bones effect to trigger a single time. If an enemy is frozen and they get the Frozen Tomb effect applied, there will actually be 2 Brittle Bones instances that trigger at once, so it's just a bigger burst of damage during frozen windows. One of the main thoughts behind Frozen Tomb is that it gives you a chance to play around Brittle Bones outside of simply frozen states. And then as for frost armor, anytime the brittle bones effect is triggered, you will gain a stacking armor buff up to a maximum for a certain amount of time. So this is to help players build around a tankier playstyle if they wanted to. And then finally, both Frozen Tomb and Frost Armor will kind of path into Long Winter. I just kind of, like I was mentioning at the start of this video, I kind of ran out of resources to kind of draw this connection between the Frost Armor and Long Winter. But essentially, Long Winter is just going to make it so that when an enemy is frozen, they're just frozen for a longer period of time, allowing players to truly capitalize on brittle bones and that shatter option, or that shatter additional damage. All right, so that's going to be it for the talent trees that I kind of put together for the elements specifically. Like I said, some of these, I had some additional thoughts that I didn't actually put into this this talent tree showcase, I guess, but I still kind of want to go over them to illustrate some potential design choices, I guess. Coup de grace, for example, would be a modifier for critical attacks or charge attacks so that they could crit and deal additional damage. And one of my inspirations behind this was Phantom Assassin in Dota 2. If you haven't seen, there's just a really cool animation where just a bunch of blood splatters all over. And I think that something like that would be really cool in No Rest for the Wicked to just add a little bit more to that gruesome effect in this game. The next three, so 9, 10, and 11, are weight class modifiers or talents that would give you additional effects based off of your weight class. If you were a lightweight, you would get the intangible effect, which is going to greatly increase your move speed, and it would also allow you to ignore unit collision. If you were a normal weight, this would give you evade extension, and this would then make it so that when you dodge roll, it now rolls further for the same time to roll. And then finally, Masochist is a heavy weight class option where taking damage while you're performing an attack would cause that attack that you're performing to deal increased damage. So really, Masochist is playing more into that, I guess, an option that you would think that a tank is really trying to build. You're trying to trade with enemies, you want to take damage so that you can actually deal increased damage. And then we have Shock Absorption. Right now, there are some Reflect builds that are present in No Rest for the Wicked, where all you have to do is simply block and you just deal damage back to enemies. I think that's a very, very brain dead and boring playstyle. No offense to anyone who plays it, but all you're doing is holding up your shield and letting enemies kind of kill themselves on your shield. And I think we need something that's a little bit more interactive. So this is my attempt at making like blocking a little bit more of an interesting build. So essentially, when you're blocking an attack, your shield would accumulate some of the damage that you've blocked up to a certain cap. And then whenever you land a parry, you consume all of that damage and deal it back to the parried enemy. So this is kind of playing a little bit more into both the blocking and the parry playstyles in No Rest for the Wicked. Next, I just want to briefly talk about curses in No Rest for the Wicked. In my previous video, I talked about how curses are just a little boring because they're just passive effects that are always active on our gear, and some of them are very detrimental, and some of them are just literal non-issues that we don't care about, such as have durability. And in my opinion, I would like to see curses be a little bit more interactive with the player, forcing us to take actions to actually resolve them, or else you kind of, you actually have to deal with deadly scenarios. So a couple of these are my stabs at new curses. So the first one would be whenever the player takes damage, they have a chance to be slowed for a certain amount for a period of time. But the way that you could get rid of this sooner is if you land an attack that would end the effect earlier. The second curse would be almost like a plague-related curse. Whenever the player takes damage, they would have a chance to be afflicted with Wither, and this is going to cause the players to have reduced armor, and it would also increase the player's equip weight for a period of time. So this might cause players who are normally a medium or normal weight class to dip into the heavyweight class, and suddenly they have to fat roll. You could deal with this by just letting the time pass and just block during it, or you could just eat food and that would immediately remove the effect early. The third curse is a burn related curse, and this is sometimes when you take damage, you'll instantaneously combust and take a very high percent of ticking damage. This would burn very quickly, but you can just roll a certain amount of time to remove this effect. And I forgot to mention, all of these curses would be able to stack up, and it would increase the detriment of these curses. So like, for example, with this rolling or this fire effect, if you stack the curse up too much, you have to roll additional amount of times. So if any of you have played World of Warcraft, during BFA, we had the corruption effects. This would be something very similar to that. And then just two more examples of runes. The first one would be when you're dealing damage, you have a chance to call down lightning on your location, which would deal a large amount of lightning damage. This is to kind of prevent players from being hyper aggressive and kind of just break up that crazy aggression. And then the last one would be if you run out of stamina, it's going to cause exhaustion, which is going to reduce the damage that you're dealing as a player, and it's going to reduce your move speed for a certain amount of time, or more specifically until your stamina has fully recovered. And that's it for my showcase of how talent trees could introduce a little bit more interesting play styles. I know stats are still very boring in No Rest for the Wicked, and I hope that we can see a little bit more involved, I guess, stat bonuses, like how we might see strength increase, our stamina regeneration or something like that. I do think that there is room for stats to grow, but I think they can grow alongside a talent tree like the one that I presented. I think if we had more interesting stats or attributes, plus a talent tree and kind of the itemization that we have currently with different curses and maybe more interesting enchantments, this game would just be taken to a whole new level, and I'd be really curious to see what that would look like. So I'm curious if you guys have any ideas on what some cool talents would look like, and maybe what you think some of the stats in the future could be for No Rest for the Wicked. Always share your thoughts in the comments. I read every comment. I'm interested to see what you guys can cook up, because this is early access. Anything can happen. We are hopefully giving the developers some good feedback, but that's all I really have to say. So if you're still watching at this point, I really appreciate you watching all the way through. This is Gilbert Troy, though, hoping you'll have a great rest of your day, and I hope to see you in the next video.